Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that breaks and destroys the false idols and icons of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. This is your host, Georgina Rose, and in this episode, I'm having an exciting guest on to talk about a subject that everyone is fascinated by. It's probably the thing people talk about the most on the internet, and that is love, relationships, and how that affects us. But from the angle of looking at the way spiritual spaces discuss relationships, because spiritual spaces discuss relationships a lot because it's an important part of our lives, and how there's a lot of discussions out there that veer into what I would call toxicity and give people really bad ideas about how to have healthy connections. Can you introduce yourself, talk about who you are, what you do, so that the audience can be familiar with who you are?
Absolutely. My name is Carly Voss. My handle is Carly of Earth on everything, and I'm a life coach. I help women with self worth, and my main focus is on helping really decondition spiritual women from what I call good girl programming, which is basically anything that we do to please others from an unconscious place of needing other people. So it's a lot of relationship work, inner work too.
So, when you discuss the idea of good girl behavior, where do you think that sort of stems from? Because I do see that a lot in honestly most women I've met.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. So the good girl thing, I think, is just it's really been baked into our DNA to kind of people please and to behave a certain way because fundamentally we're a tribal species and we need other people to survive. And for women, especially, I think because we don't really have um, on an evolutionary level, if you look at the way that we've kind of grown, we have had to rely on other people for survival. And especially women. For women, the social sphere has been our main form of survival and our main form of really getting our needs met. And if you can manipulate the social sphere really well, including manipulate your inner world, to kind of conform to the social sphere or to mold the social sphere in a way that benefits you, then you have a ticket for survival in that area. So it's really something that comes from a place of survival. And it's not like a bad thing. It's not a bad thing for that to come from survival. It's just kind of a natural thing. But to be aware of it and to be conscious of it is super, super important if you really, really want to know yourself.
So, what happens when people are not conscious of this programming and these behavioral tendencies?
That's such a good question. So as you can see, like if you just look around, you kind of see these unconscious behaviors affecting every single person on the planet, where somebody may lash out at somebody and they don't know why, or somebody may try to like put on a show, for example, like maybe like they make their appearance a certain way or they manipulate their behavior in a certain way. And it's not really coming from a place of inner authenticity and inner power. It's coming from a place of, I want to manipulate my way into getting my needs met, basically. So, like, I guess a practical example would be like somebody who goes out and buys a bunch of clothes that they think are trendy and gets their hair done in a trendy way, but none of it is really true to them. It's something that they know is trendy and it's popular right now. So they're like, I'm going to go do that. I want to look like that girl, even though that might not be their kind of version of what's best for them or their version of beauty. And they're always like, why isn't this working out for me? Why does it work for her but not for me? Well, it's because you're doing it from a place of unconscious need and doing it because you need approval. It's not coming from a genuine place of, this is really, really good for me and this is what I want.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of an idea that I've talked about a lot in my own spiritual discussions called true will, which is kind of like your purpose, I guess, is the most stripped down version of discussing it. Um, and it makes me wonder if some of this comes from something that I've noticed just looking around in the world of people kind of not having a sense of purpose or direction in their lives and not trying to discover what things like their true will might be. And so they just go with what makes sense or what seems normal. But in a world where a lot of people are unhappy, that often isn't what is actually productive for your mind and your body and your spirit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's this kind of element of know thyself in somebody who is a healthy person. And when you're raised in a society that's really, really unconscious, like the one that we're in, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just kind of part of our growing process here on the planet right now, is that we're just in an unconscious phase. And, we're waking up from that, but it's a really painful process. So most people don't have that aspect of know thyself. They're just kind of doing what they've been told to do is the right path, and when it doesn't work out, they're like, well, I guess life is just like that. I guess life is just hard. And, I guess whatever, they don't really have any explanation because they don't know. A lot of people don't know any better. And we can't really blame them for that, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and I guess the first step to breaking past these patterns would be to, I guess, kind of become less unconscious and become more aware of these things. I guess before you can even, and I wonder how you would feel about this. Do you think that before you even approach things like relationships, you need to have some base level understanding of yourself and your path and all of those type of issues?
I do. But I think it's also a journey. It's like you can approach relationships from an unconscious place and, still grow in that. But it's about kind of approaching it from a place of, I am going to grow and I am going to learn, because that kind of growth and that desire to learn is the key. Like if you don't have that, you're not going to go anywhere. So that it is really, really foundational to how to come to relationships from a place of, I have a desire to grow, if that's what you're wanting.
Yeah, I think with most things we're kind of constantly growing. Like I really like the Jungian idea of life, death, and rebirth as something we're constantly going through again and again and again. And I feel like in my own journey, like the second I feel like I understand myself or I understand something, I realize there's more of this work to be done. So I guess that's a good way to put it, because we are never, or generally not, fully aware and conscious of all the things about ourselves. So, how, if someone is knowingly kind of earlier on in that journey of self discovery and spiritual growth, how should they approach these things when they're still trying to figure out who they are and what they want and all of those huge existential questions that we have to answer at some point?
Oh yes, just let it be an unfoldment. There's an element of, I think we kind of approach spirituality often from an element of like perfectionism, where it's like, I need to get this right and I need to come at this from like this kind of divine or holy place, and it needs to kind of go a certain way. But part of the human experience is allowing yourself to mess up and allowing it to not be perfect and to let your path unfold. As long as you're growing and you have that continuous desire to evolve and to learn from your mistakes, you're going to be fine.
I really like that way of putting it, because it is true that I've talked to a lot of people and given advice to a lot of people who are new to their spiritual journey and like how to get started with practice and all that. And one of the biggest things I do hear from the people I talk to is that they are so scared of messing something up that they aren't
Mm.
really doing much. Like they're reading a lot often and they're learning, like they're taking in information, but they're too afraid to apply that information because they're worried they'll do it wrong and they'll embarrass themselves or have spiritual consequences or whatever. And I often have to be like, just start small if you're nervous, and it'll build up over time, and most mistakes are not as colossal as we think they are. And I guess that is perhaps just something that people deal with in general, and maybe it's not just something that people say when they're coming into spirituality.
Absolutely. And I think there's that spiritual, or excuse me, that perfectionism freeze where it's like, oh my God, I've done all this research and now I don't know where to begin. And you got to just kind of start somewhere. That's one thing that I focus on in my coaching, is that you just have to start somewhere. You have to stop reading and you have to stop trying to do all the research, and you have to just kind of go live your life, because that's really where the real wisdom and real experience comes from, is from those messy life experiences, from making mistakes, from going in. I don't know if you ever watched, oh, I forget what that show is called, but where the theme is like, get messy, make mistakes. It's like a kids show where they travel in the school. Oh, Magic School Bus.
Yeah, yeah, I know the show you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, like the teacher, she's always saying, get messy, make mistakes. And that's kind of my theme in life as well. Is like, you just have to go and do life. and learn from your mistakes. And that's kind of what that post was, where you had contacted me about that, the post about soul ties. And, because people are always worried about these soul ties happening. Well, what if I, like have sex with somebody and it turns out to be awful? I'm permanently bonded to this person. It's like, no, not necessarily. You just have to like let yourself go through the process of life and let yourself go through making mistakes and heal from anything that hurt you. You can't just just say, oh, I'm permanently bonded to this person. Oh, I've made a huge mistake. My life is over.
Yeah, and the idea of soul ties, for those who aren't familiar, it's basically when you have sex with someone, you develop like this permanent metaphysical tether to them due to the fact that sex is inherently a spiritual and magical act, which I do agree that sex is inherently a magical and spiritual act, but I personally take a lot of issues with the idea of soul ties because I think the big problem with it is the permanency idea, right? Obviously, when people have a sexual interaction, there's a bonding component to that in most cases. But I think the big problem with this idea is it's so permanent that it puts so much pressure on people who are learning about it, which is often kind of newer spiritual seekers, to just get, I think, really weird about sex and see it as something different than what it is. And I just think it creates a lot of anxieties, honestly.
It absolutely does. And it creates this kind of freeze internally where it's like, well, if I make one mistake here, my life is ruined forever. I was raised in a Christian environment and I went to a Christian school, and we were told that as young women that if we had sex once, we were like a used piece of gum. And that was just so like, I personally didn't really, I thought that was kind of silly because my family never thought that, they never felt that way. So I was just kind of like, what a horrible thing to say to somebody. But that's a genuine fear that people have, is if I make one single mistake, have I ruined my life and have I ruined myself? And my experience is that doesn't happen. Impactful relationships, energetic relationships that I've had have always been with people who I've had just really intense emotional ties with.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I've noticed is the soul tie thing, it is in a weird way like a repackaged Christianity type idea. Because
Absolutely.
this type of soul tie idea didn't really exist in the same capacity prior to Christianity. There definitely was like a sacred notion to sex in the ancient world, for sure. Like that did exist. But this idea of like you bind to one person and it's an unbreakable tie that exists till you die, right? That is, I feel like, a very Christian idea because of, I mean, Christian theology believes this with marriage, and it believes sex is inherently like a marital act and like divorce shouldn't exist. Isn't a lot of Christian metaphysics. Whereas in outside of Christian frameworks, if you look around the world, right, this idea does not always continue. And so it's so interesting seeing people who are in non-Christian esoteric and spiritual spaces buying into this idea. And there's just a strangeness to it because I think there is a quality to it that's a latent hangover from Christianity, really.
Absolutely. And I think that I don't yet like there's a kind of the like Christianity went through this really fundamentalist phase, and I don't think it's exited that phase at all, by the way. But that fundamentalist phase really brought this literalism to Christianity that I don't think was ever meant to be there. And that literalism is very materialistic. And so this idea of like being bonded forever with soul ties to one person is a very materialistic idea, in my opinion, because there's, if you look out like metaphysically, spiritually, the reality is that we're tied to everything because we are everything. There's this principle of oneness in the universe, and that's kind of the reality of the universe is we are all one with everything. So this kind of idea of like soul ties and you're forever bonded, through your crotch with like one person is, or two or multiple people, however many people you've had sex with, it's kind of like, it doesn't make sense on a spiritual level to me personally.
Yeah, and it gets weirder when you consider that this implies like a soul tie with multiple people for a lot of people, right? Because most people in the modern world have slept with multiple people, right? Especially as you get into
Mhm.
like your 20s and 30s and so on and so on. And so theoretically, would this mean that everyone is like permanently bonded to multiple people? And in which case it makes you wonder, like, is there a particular, like, it just makes me ask questions just on the concept of this. Like, would that imply that there's like some soul ties that are stronger than others? If you've been with someone multiple times, are you like double soul tied? Like, does this imply that every sexual act is a soul tie? Are you like if you end up in a serious long term relationship with someone, are you like literally like have like 800 ties with each other? Like, it just, I think it
Mhm.
raises a lot of weird metaphysical questions because it either implies that like when two people come together, that's a soul tie, or every single sexual act is a soul tie. And so it's just, it's metaphysically really confusing when you try to like think it through to its logical conclusion.
It definitely doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all. I think personally, what I've seen is that the soul tie thing, and it's almost like a resurgence of purity culture, but it's in a secular form instead of the evangelical Christian purity culture. It's kind of like eked its way into the mainstream. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of like modern gurus on like YouTube and like dating channels who are like, if you have sex, you're, basically like done with, like your life is over. And it's just, to me, I think it's just a backlash against, partially, it's a backlash against like hookup culture, which was kind of the antithesis to purity culture. It's like, don't control me. I'm going to do whatever I want, which it's not healthy either to just kind of willy nilly your way through a sexual encounter. But the purity culture thing, I feel like is a swing in an opposite direction. So it's almost like a pendulum swing. So that's, I feel like, where we're at right now.
I think a lot of women get into hookup culture because they feel it's like cool or expected, which is the same problem with people who are into extreme purity culture because they grew up Christian. Like, I think there's a big issue in the dating and relationship world where people, they either take one of these perspectives, right? They either take the hookup perspective or the purity perspective. And they don't try to synthesize these things at all or like find a balance or think about what actually works for their individual psychology and needs. And then if you take either one of these perspectives and it's not who you are, you're going to become very angry at it. And I think just naturally people are kind of black and white in their thinking until they grow, right? You
Mm-hmm.
swing to the other extreme, and I think people need to consider like, what do I need? How much do these things matter to me emotionally? And what are my personal goals? Instead of like hinging their wagon to one of these really polarized camps of experiencing sexuality and relationships and just try to figure out like what works for them. And that does go back to the know thyself point, right? You're not gonna have that ideal relationship you want if you don't understand your personal needs. And I think, ironically, trying to figure out your personal needs and desires is a far more spiritual pursuit than like weird ideas like soul ties. I think another one that's kind of similar is twin flames, all of that type of stuff.
That was beautiful. Bravo. I love what you just said there. Absolutely.
So, what are your thoughts on? I think a very similar idea is the twin flame thing because I remember a couple years ago, people were constantly on, especially Instagram. I don't know why it was all over Instagram more than other platforms. Like, really fixated on the idea of twin flames. And twin flames are like the idea that you have someone who, it's kind of like a soulmate idea, honestly. But basically what I was seeing is people talking about how when you're in a twin flame relationship with the person who's the one for you and your divine partner or whatever, you're pretty much supposed to tolerate like disrespect and bad treatment and conflict because they're your twin flame. And I found that to be one of the most harmful spiritual ideas I've ever seen circulated online. What are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I hate that. I think that's another thing that's been kind of misconstrued and taken the complete wrong direction. So there's, like spiritual information used to be really gate kept, and there was a reason for that. And it's because when you're at a certain level of understanding and you're not at a certain level of understanding for information that you're just not ready for, um, you getting access to information that you're just not ready for can damage you. And I think that is one of those concepts. So the twin flame or like the soulmate kind of concept these things are, I do believe that they're real, but I don't think they're real in the sense of the way that the mainstream understands them at all. I know I've had experiences with twin flames in my past, and they're not fun relationships. I mean, it hasn't been a fun thing for me, but I know it was very karmic, and it was something that I had to go through to basically kind of skyrocket myself forward. Um, and that was, I think that's kind of where people also get tied into like soul ties and things like that. They kind of confuse these almost like karmic contracts that people can have with another soul that says like, I'm coming down to have this journey with you. And you know when you're doing things like that in like another dimension, you have these agreements where we're gonna have this experience together, but in real life that's not always fun. And I think people who are, especially like in a vulnerable place, and they get kind of attached to this idea of like, well, he's my soulmate, but he's like, cheating on you and emotionally abusing you or physically abusing you, it's so damaging to people who are just not, they honestly are just not ready for that information because they don't have the boundaries necessary to protect themselves from things like that.
That's really interesting because when I think back to past relationships I have had, there's one particular one that sticks out in my brain, and it was actually a pretty crap relationship. It ended for a very clear reason, and I think that period really existed to teach me lessons the hard way, right? And so, do you think the twin flame idea is less like your ideal partner for happiness and more a person who comes into your life to bitch slap you with information you need?
In my experience, yes. Yeah. Like it's not, and I think like getting all twisted up in the twin flame idea and like putting labels on it, I think in the wrong state of consciousness, that can really, really hurt somebody. Like you can mistake this person for your like eternal perfect partner when it's like, no, actually, this was just one of your relationships that you were meant to go through that was supposed to grow you.
Do you think that we have, like, due to spiritual causes of any variety, a perfect partner that exists? Or do you think it's more like there's a bunch of people who could potentially be good partners and you should seek out just high compatibility?
I love that question. So I think this comes back to the know thyself thing. I don't think there's like one perfect partner necessarily, but I think that you can absolutely have a contract with somebody to meet and to grow together, if that makes sense. But I think you have that with multiple people. So this is what I would call kind of the traditional soulmate. It's the person that you meet and you recognize them immediately. That's happened to me several times, mostly with friends. There are a lot of people that I know for a fact are soulmates of mine, but we're friends, and I know our spirits are meant to grow together in this lifetime in some way or another. And those relationships are always very, very beautiful.
That friend point is really interesting because I do think people talk a lot about romantic relationships with these topics, but friendship relationships do have a metaphysical component to them too. And I think that is often understated, and perhaps it is because we definitely like, I think in our culture we prioritize romantic relationships far above platonic and friend-based relationships just generally as a culture. But I think, we should consider that friendships have metaphysical value too and are just as important to have in your life.
We absolutely do value those romantic relationships more than friendships. And I think that's really, really unfortunate because the most impactful relationships in my life have been friendship relationships, and the friendship breakups that I've been through have been more painful than the romantic relationships breakups that I've been through, just for me personally. And my friends have had, the biggest impact on my life over my romantic relationships so far. And I think it's really unfortunate that we discredit the friendship aspect of, a healthy relationship as well. We don't really consider it. I see a lot of people saying things like, oh yeah, my friend and I, but it's like they don't even know their middle name. So our definition of friendship as a society is kind of shallow. And that's unfortunate.
I completely agree. I think that friendship is very important. And I think community in general, people really, really struggle without community. And I think one of the biggest problems with the culture currently is just that I think a lot of people are really alienated and don't have community at all. And I think if people could develop communities, especially ones in real life, in their area that they can lean on and get support from, I think people would have a lot of just honestly psychological better well-being, um, in
I
general.
completely agree. And that's like one of my main focuses in life is to help people get healthy enough so that they're able to have these conscious relationships with people and form communities, because that's where we're headed. In my opinion, we need to be heading towards more conscious communities with each other so that we're creating like almost little pockets of like healthy individuals that are really benefiting not just themselves but each other, and that kind of benefiting of each other as a like healthy kind of conscious tribe benefits every single person around them as well.
Oh, absolutely. Because one thing that is true, and we're told this from such a secular perspective, right? Like the people you're around affect you, right? You hang around with the bad crowd. You know, you're told this as a kid, right? You'll become a bad kid or whatever, right? But this idea, it has a spiritual dimension to it. It's kind of like an osmosis quality, right? What energies and paradigms and things you surround yourself with seep into you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is why you need to be careful about where you spend your time. And this does not just include romantic relationships, though it 100% does include romantic relationships. It includes everyone around you, because we think often, I think, in very individualistic terms, but like the communities around us affect us greatly. The spirits, all of it affects us. And I think we need to consider, like, where are we putting our physical body and our energetic body, and what is that going to seep in?
Absolutely. And that's kind of another that always is coming back to this kind of theme that I've noticed of just know thyself. So once you know yourself and you know what energy you want to be surrounded by, you know your values, you can go out and find people who have those same values and create or compatible values. They don't necessarily have to be the same. And from there, you can create those communities. But there's that aspect of know yourself first before you can do that. And even though you do need to know yourself, on the way you can still go on and like stumble and make these mistakes, because that's how you do become to know yourself, is and that's how you do grow, is by going out and making friends with people, and they turned out not to be the right group, and then you go out and you get into a romantic relationship. Well, that turned out not to be the correct one, and here's why, and here's what I learned from that. So there's no such thing as time wasted when it comes to relationships, if you're growing and if you're learning from that relationship.
Really well put. Speaking of compatibility, I'm wondering your thoughts on how much, when someone meets someone that they're interested in romantically, um, invest into looking into spiritual compatibility. Because I know often people will try to get like someone's, say, astrological natal chart, before they commit to them, and explore a relationship with them to see if like a synastry chart rules them compatible or whatnot. Do
Mm.
you think people should do these compatibility searching spiritual practices, or kind of just let things unfold?
I love that question. It's so good. So yeah, this was something that I always do with everybody that I kind of get into a relationship with, like a few months in. I'm like, what's your chart? What's your chart? I think it can be fun, but if you don't have these boundaries around the astrology chart, and you don't have this like the sense of, like, I can look at it and not let it rule my mind and not let it kind of overtake my thinking, then I think that's important. And if you can't do that, then I wouldn't look at the chart, because I think things unfolding naturally the way that they're meant to unfold is probably the best course in my experience and in my opinion. And then going and looking at the chart after, and saying, oh, here's why this happened and this happened. That's also something I've done when relationships have ended. I go back and I'll look at the chart and say, oh, we were not in communication here, because Mars was sitting on my like whatever. So I don't know if I would go into it right away starting from the chart, because there's a lot of like the chart is more of a blueprint than um, a definite like rule of this is what it's going to look like. So I would go into it just like chest first, like let's see how it goes, and then look at the chart later.
I think that's a really healthy way to view it, because I do think people when you get into astrology, I think people develop very different relationships to it. Like I think some people they use it as a way to like reflect, and then other people I do think develop this like weird codependency with astrology. I also see it with like tarot and really any
Yeah.
practice that looks into the future, right? Where people will kind of become like slavish to the practice. Like they'll but like I remember I met someone who would like pull tarot cards every time they left the house, even to like run errands. And I'm like, you need to put the cards down a little bit. So I guess it gets into just having a healthy relationship with these spiritual technologies we have, and using them productively. I do think it's worth looking at someone's chart. I tend to do this when I get into relationships, just I think also to give you guidance on how to best interact with this person, because
Hmm.
you can gain so much insight from someone's astrological chart that I think it can give you like tips on how to interact with this person in a healthier way. So I think that also is a good way to approach it.
Definitely, that is a good point. I like that. I agree with you there. But I
So
did like the point that you made about like kind of outsourcing your power to these things, because that can be like once you notice that you're outsourcing your power and you're like, I need to get my tarot read, I need to know if we're compatible. It's like there's an element of, am I trusting myself to know this well enough, or do I need to kind of use these tools? Because I love tarot and I love astrology, I love all of those things, but there there was a certain point in my life when I just didn't touch them for like a year because I was so deep into just, okay, what is myself saying? Like, what am I feeling right now? And I think that's important.
yeah, I think that people often struggle to trust themselves. Like it's different than understanding yourself to trust yourself. And I think a lot of people do not feel secure in their ability to make decisions or take actions. Like they're so hesitant and doubtful about their own behavior and their own nature. And I think that that's one of the things that, I think to learn to trust yourself, really the only way to do that is, I would say, like extensive shadow work. Do you think if someone is to explore an idea like shadow work, they can do it like while a relationship evolves? Should they do it as the relationship evolves or before or after? Like where in the timeline of a relationship evolution should someone be doing that like heavy shadow work stuff that a lot of people, I mean pretty much everyone needs to do?
That's such a good question. So I'm of the opinion that you should just do shadow work whenever you feel the need arise, like whenever there's a trigger. And sometimes, like, that could be a few months into the relationship. Sometimes you're triggered, right away by somebody. But if you're feeling like a trigger and you're feeling this need to kind of go in and like take a look at your shadow because there's something that's like poking you internally, go in whenever you feel like it. I don't think there's a right time to do shadow work unless there's like that internal nudge of, okay, something's off and something's bothering me. And I don't think like where you're at in a relationship necessarily has anything to do with it. It's more about where you're at in your relationship with yourself and what is this person bringing up in me right now? Like what button did they just push in me, and why did they push that button? What is that button being pushed now telling me that I need to look at?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What would you say is the biggest piece of spiritual misinformation about relationships that you encounter online?
Oh my goodness. That's such a good question. There's so much, honestly. I think just this idea that a relationship can only look one way. The biggest bit of misinformation that I see is just the fact that relationships are messy and you're never going to be able to put them in a box. That's kind of the thing about humans that's really frustrating to our logical brains, is that we try to make relationships something that we can understand logically, and it's not. It's something that you kind of float with, and it depends on who you are, what your sole purpose is, like what your mission here is, is and it can evolve over time. There's so many different like combinations and ways that you can do relationships, that there's just no one right way to do it, and there's no like singular like this is how you're meant to do
A
it.
lot of sense. I think in general, people struggle to think outside of logic, which sounds really bizarre.
Yeah.
But I think, logic exists, rationality exists, but there are so many things that kind of defy it. And I think actually, in general, if you're trying to approach spirituality and have spiritual growth, you need to set logic aside pretty regularly
Yeah.
and have that open-ended way of thinking, because these spiritual concepts, once you actually start experiencing them, are so abstract they kind of
Hmm.
defy human logic. And I think there's an ironically human-centric mindset to believe that everything has to fit within this logical constraint that humans are obsessed with. So it's just, there's a lot of interesting stuff just in that whole shebang.
Absolutely. And it makes sense, right? Because the brain is a survival mechanism. Our logical center helps us survive in this physical reality. And that's perfect. That makes perfect sense. And when we're overtaken by logic, it's almost like the yin and the yang, the masculine and the feminine, or one and zero. There's one that's logical and that's kind of rigid. And then there's one that's chaotic and it's illogical and it's super creative, and we need both to be able to function well, and relationships are no different. So there's absolutely a logical component to relationships, but in trying to understand relationships in a logical level, like in trying to put them into a box, it doesn't work.
So speaking of like the divine feminine, how can someone connect to the divine feminine and not fall into good girl programming? Because I think a lot of people have the divine feminine in this box that I believe misses the fullness of it, that is that kind of programming, which is very, very unfortunate. But I see a lot of people falling into this trap. So, how do you think someone should avoid this trap?
Oh, wow. I love that so much. So if you're approaching the divine feminine from a way of, I have to do it this way, you are approaching the divine feminine from a masculine way. You're not actually connecting to your own inner expression and your own understanding of the divine feminine. The divine feminine is chaos. And there's a lot of people out there who are like, the divine feminine, she's soft and she's always laying on the couch and she's always wearing pink frilly dresses. And it's like, well, maybe that is the expression for one woman, but for another woman, it could be like rolling naked in the mud. So it's really about connecting to what just feels free to you, because the divine feminine is chaos. And so that's this kind of freedom. It's almost this kind of like crazy energy. There's a really good book. Oh, I forget what it's called. It's by Christina Pinkola Estes, I believe her name is. Oh, it's called Women Who Run with the Wolves. And that's a really good kind of like primer on the divine feminine, where it's like this kind of raw, wild freedom. And it's not this like, oh, I need to do things this way and put on my hair and makeup this way. And I need to like wear makeup every single day and get my toes done. I mean, if you want to do those things, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But, having all these rules and constraints around what you need to do to be connected to the divine feminine is literally the antithesis of the divine feminine. The divine feminine is more of this free flowing energy.
Yeah, and you want to know what's so interesting about it? I think a lot of people don't understand that the divine feminine is a metaphysical concept and principle and not cultural ideas about femininity.
Absolutely. Yes. And I did just make a video about this. It's called Performative Femininity on my YouTube channel, where it goes really into how the feminine isn't that, and it's not cultural, like it's not gender roles. It's absolutely an energy, and it's a metaphysical energy that makes up all matter in existence. It's not something that we invented, it's something that we discovered.
Yeah, it's completely different than like feminine, right?
Yeah.
Like
Mm-hmm.
if we were to have a better understanding of feminine in some dream world where I can control cultural norms, I would definitely try to link these things more. But I think how we see femininity, right? It's an ever-changing goalpost, right? It's like
Yeah.
always like every century, right? Femininity is completely different. Every decade, really. Whereas the
Yeah.
divine feminine being a metaphysical principle doesn't change, right? And I think
Exactly.
that's why there's this disconnect between the two, because metaphysical principles don't change, time, society, culture, all of that radically changes and at a very fast speed in the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. You are speaking my language. You get it. Absolutely. That's so important to understand. And I think people get really confused about that. Like, And that's why there's so much confusion today around this. It's like, well, I don't want to do this gender role, so screw the feminine. Why do I have to be the divine feminine? Well, you don't understand the divine feminine if that's what you think, because you can't understand the divine feminine from a materialistic place, because it's not a materialistic thing. It does make up matter, but it's not necessarily like frilly pink dresses. So it can be part of that. It's just, yeah, like you said, it's unchanging.
Yeah, I think there's a problem as when these spiritual ideas get more mainstream, which the divine feminine in the past 2 years has gotten really, really mainstream as a concept. Every
Yeah.
single time one of these esoteric ideas enters the mainstream, we're also seeing it now with Stoicism, because Stoicism is really cool right now, right? The second a spiritual idea reaches a mainstream level, it's going to get basically the more mainstream an idea gets, right? The more it's going to be diluted and watered down and kind of transformed into something else. So by the time it reaches like the mainstream populace and it's like a TikTok trend with millions of views, right? You've got it diluted to such an extreme point that it almost gets detached from spirituality and becomes a materialist idea, which spiritualism and materialism are simply not the same thing. And I think the divine feminine has had one of the most extreme dilutions of any concept I've seen so far.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think that kind of comes back to the main point. The main reason that I made my coaching practice in the first place was because of what I call the bastardization of the feminine, which is this kind of, we're so disconnected as a culture and as a society from the feminine that we don't even know what the feminine is. We have no honor for the feminine. We have no respect for the feminine. We don't have respect for the healthy masculine either, but it is more acceptable to be masculine in our society than it is to be feminine. It's more respected. It's more honored. And so even our understanding of, there's no way we could expect our society to really understand the divine feminine, because right now, as it stands, we think that when we say anything's feminine, we're thinking about frilly pink dresses and makeup.
Yeah. And it is true for the masculine too. Like when people think of the masculine, they think of like stereotypical man things and not anything metaphysical either. And so for everyone, it confuses people and it creates these distortions, because I would say like you see all these bloggers trying to talk about masculinity or whatever, and it's like this weird perversion of that idea that becomes like straight up like toxic. Like I think people just we're kind of confused creatures, to be honest, and that's it just leads to like the strangest versions of things. It's like a weird simulation of a concept that completely misses what that concept actually is, and I think we're seeing a lot of that online.
I completely agree. And that kind of goes back to that know thyself. When you know who you are, you can separate yourself from the programming. So we have all of this distortion around, these concepts like the masculine and the feminine. It's because of our cultural programming that we have not questioned, because we do not know ourselves well enough to question those things. And once you question those things, you're able to get to that clarity and that understanding of, oh, I understand the divine masculine, I understand the divine feminine. It becomes something that's just natural for you to get, basically.
Yeah. As one of the last things I want to discuss, how can someone use spirituality to have better relationships and connections? Like, where should someone start if they want to begin that journey?
That's a great question. So I think it all really comes back to knowing yourself and knowing who you are and what you want and how to communicate that. And the spiritual aspect of that, everything is spiritual, but to kind of approach life from this conscious way, to me, is the spiritual path. And approaching life from this place of, okay, I know why I'm doing this. I know why I want this kind of person. I know why I have this trigger, and I'm going to consciously work on that, is super important. So we were talking about shadow work earlier, coming at relationships from this place of, I'm here to grow and I'm here to learn about myself and I'm here to learn about you and I'm here to help you on your path as well. It becomes this kind of walk of love where you are walking with other people in this place of love and open-heartedness, because you're on a journey together. And I think that is, to me, that's the most important thing about relationships, is being able to go on a journey together in a conscious manner. And that requires that you are honest with yourself and that you know yourself and that you're doing that inner work and you're doing the spiritual work as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think in general, in spirituality, and this is something I've been talking a lot about recently, you need to learn about these things, you need to practice these things, but you need a third limb to that, which is taking time to just contemplate and sit with your mind and think about your experiences and just
Yeah.
like dwell and try to not like in a bad way or like an
Mhm.
obsessive way, like that's toxic too. Don't just like sit in your room all day and cry and like think about your problems, but like consider greatly like your needs and just spend time in thought, right? I think that is incredibly important on a spiritual journey. Seeing it more as a meditative process than one of like, emotionally self-flagellating, I think is also very important, because I think there is a kind of emotionally masochistic way contemplation can exist, and I don't think that's good. But positive, productive, good contemplation, I think, is really, really important for the spiritual journey in all aspects.
Absolutely. I always encourage everybody to journal and to journal every day. And then at the end of the week, look back on what you've been through that week. That has made such a massive shift in my life because on a day to day basis, we don't see our growth and we don't see our progress. But when we're looking back, even on a weekly basis, it's like, oh my goodness, I've grown so much in this area. And that's super important to see your own growth because it gives you that kind of sense of power.
Yeah. Keeping records of things is really, really valuable. Pretty much every single spiritual tradition, if you ever join a group or some organized tradition, right? They always recommend keeping a record of your experiences and journaling. And it's so simple, but it's so, so important if you want
It is.
good tracking of what you're doing and to reflect on those experiences later on. Because often I find when it comes to spiritual experiences, or honestly life experiences in general, as above, so below, right? You'll notice things down the line that in the moment you experienced the first time you didn't catch, but were very much there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even if it's like something that you catch years later, like I have journals that I'll go back and I'll read years later and I'm like, wow, oh my goodness, I didn't see this or I didn't see that. And now look at me, now look at what I've healed from that. Now look at how much I've changed when I wouldn't have even recognized that if I hadn't gone back and looked at that progress.
Yeah, it's really good to see things as like benchmarks of growth. And with
Hmm.
that, I think that's a really good place to sort of end this conversation. Where can people find you? Where's your corner on the internet if people want to learn more about you and see more of what you have to say?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. My handle for everything is Carly of Earth, and that's on all platforms.
Lovely. Thank you so much for coming on. I think this has been a really useful conversation that a lot of people will take benefit from. This has been your host, Georgina Rose. If you want to support the podcast, you should join the Patreon, the Postmodern Iconoclast. On the Patreon, you get a bonus mini episode every single show that I record before my lovely guest come on, and you get a bonus episode 8 times a year. Um, as well, you can find me, Georgina Rose, under Dot Darling on every platform under the sun. And with that, have an amazing night, mid afternoon, mid morning, mid evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye.